Joan Rivers' betrayal, the end of late night's greatest friendship, Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers. For years, they were late night royalty, mentor and protege, the king and his comedy heir. He made her a star. She made him laugh like no one else could. But in 1986, everything changed. A phone call that was never made, a friendship shattered beyond repair, a betrayal that Johnny Carson would never forgive until the day he died. Welcome back to Legacy News, where today we're uncovering the shocking truth behind one of the most painful breakups in television history. Joan Rivers was the first permanent guest host of The Tonight Show, the woman Johnny Carson himself declared would be his rightful successor. But what you're about to hear will reveal how this comedy partnership imploded overnight, leaving behind decades of bitterness that followed both stars to their graves. You might think you know this story, but trust me, what happened behind the scenes was far more heartbreaking than what played out in the headlines. The shock, the betrayal, the misunderstandings, and the pride that prevented reconciliation, it's all here in the story NBC never wanted told. And by the end of today's video, you'll discover the heartbreaking contents of letters Joan wrote but never sent, right up until her final days. So settle in as we reveal the truth about Joan Rivers, Johnny Carson, and the television war that forever altered the landscape of late night. Before we dive deeper into this fascinating Hollywood feud, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to Legacy News. We bring you the authentic, well-researched stories behind the headlines. No exaggeration, no made-up drama, just the fascinating truth about the stars you love. And don't forget to ring that notification bell so you never miss our weekly uploads about Hollywood's most intriguing legends. The rise of Joan Rivers. Before we dive into the betrayal, we need to understand just how close these two comedy legends really were. And believe me, their relationship went far deeper than most people realize. Born Joan Alexandra Malinsky in Brooklyn in 1933, Rivers came into the world during the Great Depression to Russian Jewish immigrant parents. Her father was a doctor who, while respected in the community, never achieved the financial security the family hoped for. This early exposure to financial anxiety would shape Joan's decisions throughout her life. "I was always worried about money," she would later confess. "Even when I was doing well, I never trusted that it would last. That kind of fear never really leaves you." Her parents had conventional dreams for their daughter. Her father expected Joan to marry a doctor, not become an entertainer. "My parents wanted me to marry a nice Jewish doctor and be a nice Jewish wife with nice Jewish children," Joan once explained. "Instead, I became this creature with a mouth who told jokes." Her journey into comedy wasn't a straight line. After graduating from Barnard College with a degree in English literature and anthropology, she worked a series of odd jobs: advertising agency writer, fashion coordinator at Bond clothing stores, and even a tour guide at Rockefeller Center. All the while, she harbored dreams of becoming an actress, not a comedian. "I wanted to be Katharine Hepburn," she would later admit. "I never thought about being a comedian. I wanted to be a serious actress, but nobody would hire me." What Joan didn't know then was that her greatest success would come from a career path she never imagined, and that the man who would help her reach the top would ultimately be the one to cast her into show business exile. The comedy clubs of the late 1950s were brutal training grounds, especially for women. This was the era of Lenny Bruce and Mort Saul, edgy, intellectual male comics who were revolutionizing stand-up with political commentary and cultural critique. Female comedians were expected to be cute and self-deprecating, talking mainly about their husbands and children. Joan began performing under various stage names before settling on Joan Rivers. She worked wherever would have her: Greenwich Village coffee houses, strip clubs in the Catskills, seedy bars where the audience was more interested in their drinks than her jokes. For years, she lived on the brink of financial ruin, sometimes sleeping in her car between gigs. "I played places so far out in New Jersey that even Jesus couldn't find them," she'd joke later, places where the audience would rather watch the ice melt in their drinks than listen to me. What separated Rivers from many struggling performers was her relentless work ethic. She kept meticulous journals of every performance, noting which jokes worked, which bombed, and why. She studied audiences with an anthropologist's eye, developing an uncanny ability to read a room and adjust her material accordingly. Her early material often focused on her insecurities, her appearance, her failed relationships, her struggle to find a husband. "I was dating a football player. That didn't work out. He couldn't come over to my house. He couldn't fit in the door," she would quip. In an era when female comics were expected to be demure, Joan was bracingly honest about her desires and frustrations. This honesty came at a cost. Bookers found her too aggressive, too unladylike for mainstream audiences. Male comedians could talk about sex and bodily functions, but when Joan broached similar territory, she was labeled vulgar and inappropriate. She faced constant rejection, including a devastating early audition for The Tonight Show when Jack Paar was host. After her set, Paar reportedly told her, "You're not funny. Women aren't supposed to be funny. Go have babies." babies. Her darkest moment came in the early 1960s. After yet another crushing rejection, Joan sat alone in her parked car, feeling as if her career and her future were over. She later said she was ready to end everything right then. What snapped her out of that despair wasn't a sudden break or a phone call, but her faithful dog Spike staring up at her from the passenger seat, reminding her she still had someone who needed her. Little did Joan know that the darkest moment of her early life would pale in comparison to the career and personal devastation that awaited her 2 decades later, when her greatest professional gamble would cost her everything she held dear. This blend of desperation and dark humor would become Rivers' trademark. She found comedy in her own pain, transforming rejection and heartbreak into punchlines that resonated with audiences who recognized their own struggles in hers. It was 1965 when Joan Rivers, then a struggling comedian playing gritty clubs and facing constant rejection, finally got her big break on The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson, already television royalty, took one look at this brash, insecure, whip-smart Jewish girl from Brooklyn and saw something special. As Joan walked off stage after her first appearance, Carson did something unprecedented. He looked into the camera and said 7 words that changed her life forever. "God, you're going to be a star." And he meant it. Carson wasn't just being kind, he became Joan's champion, bringing her back again and again. By the 1970s, their on-screen chemistry was undeniable. The Brooklyn firecracker could make the normally reserved Carson double over with laughter. Their back-and-forth banter crackled with electricity that viewers couldn't get enough of. "Johnny was the one who discovered me," Joan would later say. "He was my mentor. He was the one who made it all happen." Behind the scenes, their friendship blossomed. They dined together with their spouses. Carson advised Joan on her career moves. He became godfather to her daughter Melissa. But let's not pretend everything was perfect. While he was her biggest supporter on screen, Carson was also notoriously private and emotionally reserved off camera. Many who knew him described a man who kept most people at arm's length, even those he seemingly favored. Johnny Carson was born in Corning, Iowa in 1925, but spent most of his formative years in Nebraska. His mother Ruth was famously cold and withholding of affection, a dynamic Carson would joke about on air, but privately acknowledged as deeply wounding. "She was the toughest son of a bitch of them all," Carson once said of his mother. "There was no cuddling, no lap-sitting." This emotional deprivation shaped Carson's approach to relationships throughout his life. He developed a public persona that was charming, attentive, and warm, while maintaining a private self that few people ever truly accessed. Even his closest friends described a certain emotional distance they could never quite bridge. "Johnny could be with you, but not with you at the same time," observed Ed McMahon, his sidekick of 30 years. There was always something held back, some part of himself he never quite revealed. Carson's romantic life reflected these difficulties with intimacy. He was married 4 times, with his first 3 marriages ending in divorce. His second wife, Joan, filed for divorce twice, citing his emotional unavailability as a primary factor. "It's lonely being married to Johnny," she told reporters. "Even when he's home, he's not really there." Professional relationships often followed a similar pattern. Carson would embrace certain performers, bringing them into his inner circle, only to abruptly cut them off if he perceived any slight or betrayal. Comedian David Brenner, once a Carson favorite, found himself appearing less frequently on The Tonight Show after signing a development deal with another network. Even though the project wasn't in direct competition with Carson, Johnny's approval was like sunshine, warm and life-giving, explained a former Tonight Show writer. But it could be withdrawn in an instant, like a cloud passing over. And once you were in shadow, it was very hard to find the light again. As Carson's former lawyer Henry Bushkin revealed in his tell-all book, Johnny was a complicated man with deep trust issues stemming from childhood trauma and 3 failed marriages. But despite his personal complexities, by 1983, their professional relationship reached its pinnacle when Carson named Joan his permanent guest host, the only one in the show's history. This wasn't just a prestigious title, it was widely seen as Carson anointing his eventual successor. Each time Johnny took one of his frequent vacations, it was Joan who sat behind that coveted desk, keeping his seat warm and the ratings high. Being Johnny's permanent guest host was like being the heir apparent to the comedy throne, explains former NBC executive Warren Littlefield. It was understood throughout the industry that Joan was being positioned to take over whenever Johnny decided to retire. For 3 years, this arrangement worked brilliantly. Joan's guest hosting stints were popular with viewers and advertisers alike. Johnny got his vacation time without worrying about the show suffering in his absence. NBC had a solid succession plan for their most valuable property, and Joan Rivers was finally getting the recognition her decades of hard work deserved. Everything was perfect. until it wasn't. The Fox deal. The trouble began brewing in early 1986. Fox, a brand new upstart television network created by media mogul Rupert Murdoch, was looking to make a splash in late night. Their ambitious plan? To compete directly with NBC's Tonight Show by creating their own rival program in the same time slot. And who better to lead this new venture than the woman who had proven she could successfully host The Tonight Show? The spring of 1986 found Joan Rivers at a crossroads. Now in her 50s, she had achieved significant success as a comedian, best-selling author, and Carson's permanent guest host. Yet she still lacked the one thing she craved most: security. Her husband Edgar Rosenberg was serving as her manager, and together they were keenly aware of the television industry's brutal realities. Carson, though in his 60s, showed no signs of retiring. NBC had made no commitments about Joan's future once Johnny eventually stepped down, and the network's new president, Brandon Tartikoff, was rumored to favor younger talent like David Letterman as Carson's eventual successor. Joan could read the writing on the wall, explained Mark Breslin, founder of the Yuk Yuk's comedy club chain and a friend of Rivers. She was a middle-aged woman in an industry that worshipped youth. Guest hosting was fine, but without a succession plan, she was essentially treading water. Into this uncertainty stepped Barry Diller, chairman of the newly formed Fox Broadcasting Company. Rupert Murdoch had tasked Diller with establishing Fox as America's fourth major network, and a late-night show to compete with NBC's Tonight Show was a key part of the strategy. Fox came to Joan with an offer that seemed impossible to refuse: her very own late-night talk show. Not just as a guest host, but as the star. Her name would be in the title. She would have creative control. And most importantly, at 53 years old, in an industry that routinely discarded women over 40, she would finally have job security. The offer reportedly came with a staggering $10 million contract, serious money in 1986, especially for a female comedian who had spent most of her career fighting for every opportunity. For Joan, who had grown up poor and lived through financial struggles even at the height of her fame, this kind of security was nearly impossible to turn down. It wasn't just about money, insisted Melissa Rivers in defending her mother's decision years later. It was about finally having a show that was hers, not just keeping someone else's chair warm. The initial discussions with Fox were kept strictly confidential. Rivers and her husband signed non-disclosure agreements during the negotiation process, which would later complicate her ability to discuss the offer with Carson or NBC executives. But there was a problem, a big one. Taking this job would mean directly competing against the man who had made her career possible. It would mean being seen as disloyal to Carson, to NBC, and to the Tonight Show audience who had embraced her. According to multiple sources, Joan did attempt to use the Fox offer as leverage with NBC. Through intermediaries, she made it known that she had another opportunity and would be interested in hearing NBC's counterproposal. The response was disappointing. NBC executives, perhaps confident in Carson's drawing power and irreplaceability, made no serious effort to retain her. They essentially called her bluff, said a former NBC executive who requested anonymity. The attitude was, if she's got a better offer, she should take it. There was a fundamental miscalculation about how serious the Fox offer was. Joan later claimed she agonized over the decision. According to her daughter Melissa, Mom was torn apart by it. She knew what this would mean for her relationship with Johnny, but she also couldn't pass up the opportunity to finally have her own show. The final decision to accept Fox's offer came after what Joan described as agonizing deliberation. She was acutely aware of what accepting would mean for her relationship with Carson, but also believed that at 53 this might be her last chance to headline her own show. Mom kept saying, "Johnny will understand. He's a businessman too," Melissa Rivers recalled. She truly believed that once she explained the opportunity, he would give her his blessing. The deal was signed in secret, but before the news went public, Joan knew there was one person she needed to tell personally: Johnny Carson. And this is where the story gets complicated, and where the fatal miscommunication occurred that would end their friendship forever. According to Joan, she tried repeatedly to reach Carson to tell him about the Fox deal before it became public. "I called Johnny 3 times to talk about it," she would insist in interviews years later. "He wouldn't take my calls." Carson's team tells a completely different story. They claim Joan never made any serious attempt to inform Johnny before signing with Fox. Fred DeCordova, Carson's longtime producer, stated emphatically, "She never called. We have phone logs. There was no attempt to reach Johnny before the announcement." Whether Joan truly tried to reach Johnny remains one of the great unresolved questions in this saga. What we do know for certain is that Carson found out about Joan's new show the way the rest of America did, from a Fox press release and subsequent news reports. For a man with Carson's well-documented issues with trust and abandonment, this was the ultimate betrayal. His protégé hadn't just taken another job, she had secretly aligned herself with a direct competitor and hadn't even given him the courtesy of a heads-up. The confrontation that followed would be the last time these two comedy legends would ever exchange words, and the 8 seconds of conversation would haunt Joan Rivers for the rest of her life. When Joan finally did reach Johnny by phone after the news broke, the conversation was brief and ice-cold. According to Rivers, Carson said only, "You didn't call me, and it's too late now." Then he hung up on her. He would never speak to her again. The aftermath and Carson's cold shoulder. The fallout was swift and devastating. Johnny, who rarely showed emotion on air, made his feelings crystal clear through his actions. Joan Rivers' name became forbidden on The Tonight Show. Her photos were removed from the show's walls. Her comedy albums were taken out of rotation on the show's Comedy Shelf segment. It was as if NBC was trying to erase any evidence that Joan Rivers had ever been associated with the program. Carson himself addressed the situation only once on air, telling his audience with an icy calm, "Joan Rivers will not be back on this show. I felt betrayed. That's it. It's over." The audience applauded his decisiveness. Behind the scenes, NBC executives claim Carson went further. "Johnny made it very clear," revealed a former NBC executive who requested anonymity. "Anyone who worked with Joan would never work with him. You had to choose sides. And in television, nobody was going to choose Joan over Johnny." Almost overnight, Joan Rivers went from comedy royalty to industry pariah. Famous friends stopped calling. Invitations dried up. Vegas bookings were canceled. It wasn't just Carson who froze her out. It was an entire industry afraid of crossing its biggest star. The Late Show starring Joan Rivers premiered with considerable fanfare on October 9th, 1986. The set was glamorous, featuring Joan's signature touches, including a lavish desk with an Art Deco design. The opening night boasted an impressive guest lineup including Cher, David Lee Roth, and Pee Wee Herman, though notably, many A-list stars had declined invitations, already signaling the industry's alignment with Carson. Joan opened with a monologue that addressed the unavoidable topic. "I couldn't wait. I'm getting older. Johnny's guests are getting older. I'm so glad to be here. I'm working again at night, where I belong." The Los Angeles Times called the debut impressive, and initial ratings were promising, especially for the fledgling Fox network. But behind the scenes, trouble was brewing from day one. Fox executives, while pleased with the publicity surrounding their new late-night entry, began to panic about directly challenging the Carson program. Network president Barry Diller and chairman Rupert Murdoch had recruited Rivers specifically for her sharp, acerbic comedy style, but quickly developed cold feet about letting Joan be Joan. "The notes started coming immediately," recalled Frank Conniff, one of the show's writers. "They wanted her to be softer, less abrasive. They'd say things like, 'Can we tone down the 'can we talk' catchphrase?' That was like asking Johnny not to do his golf swing." The network installed various executives to help guide the show, effectively undermining Joan's creative control. A particularly contentious issue was the booking of guests. A-list celebrities, fearing repercussions from Carson, largely avoided The Late Show. When Fox executives managed to book someone notable, they would often override Joan's interview style, insisting she be less intrusive and more fawning. "They wanted her to be a combination of Dinah Shore and Merv Griffin," said a former producer who requested anonymity. "Warm, non-threatening, and completely unlike the Joan Rivers who had built a career on being brutally honest, Edgar Rosenberg, Joan's husband, and the show's executive producer, found himself increasingly at odds with Fox management. Having negotiated what they believed was substantial creative control, the Rosenbergs were stunned by the network's heavy-handed interference. "Edgar was fighting battles on all fronts," explained a staff member. "He was trying to protect Joan's vision for the show while dealing with network executives who seemed to regret hiring her in the first place." By early 1987, the strain was showing on air. Joan, normally the consummate professional, occasionally seemed flustered or irritated during tapings. Ratings began to decline as the show struggled to establish a consistent identity amid the conflicting directions. Behind closed doors, Fox executives were already planning something that would destroy not just Joan's show, but her entire life as she knew it. To make matters worse, The Late Show starring Joan Rivers on Fox was plagued with problems from the start. Fox executives meddled constantly, pushing Joan to tone down her acerbic style and be more likable, essentially asking her to abandon the very qualities qualities that had made her successful. Ratings were disappointing, critics were harsh, and just 7 months after its premiere, Fox fired Joan from her own show in May 1987. In a particularly cruel twist, they informed Edgar first, effectively undermining Joan's authority on her own show. They told Edgar to tell Joan she was fired, Melissa Rivers revealed years later. Can you imagine putting a husband in that position? It was humiliating for both of them. The personal cost was even higher. In the midst of this professional crisis, Joan's husband, Edgar Rosenberg, who had been serving as her manager and the show's producer, fell into a deep depression after also being fired by Fox. The man who had managed his wife's career for decades, who had negotiated the Fox deal that was supposed to secure their future, now found himself blamed for its failure. And the phone call Joan dreaded most was about to come, from Philadelphia. On August 14, 1987, Edgar checked into a hotel room in Philadelphia and took a lethal dose of prescription medication. He left several notes, including one to Joan, that reportedly read in part, "I love you and Melissa more than life itself, but I can't go on." Joan was filming a small movie role in London when she received the devastating news. Her daughter Melissa, then 19, had to identify her father's body. In the span of just 1 year, Joan Rivers had lost her mentor, her show, and her husband of 22 years. It was by any measure a devastating series of blows that would have broken most people. It was the darkest period imaginable, she would later say. "I lost everything. My career was in shambles, Edgar was gone, and I was suddenly a widow with a teenage daughter to support and $37 million in debt because of bad investments and the Fox deal collapse." What made this period even more painful was Carson's continued silence. Despite their decades-long professional relationship and personal friendship, despite knowing of Edgar's death and Joan's devastation, Johnny never reached out. "When Edgar died, I thought Johnny would call," Joan admitted in a 2012 interview. "Through all the years, I'd always sent him birthday wishes, Christmas gifts, congratulations on the birth of his children. I truly thought he would reach out when Edgar died. That's when I knew it was really over between us." Carson, true to his word, maintained his silence. Not only did he never speak to Joan again, but he also made sure she remained banned from The Tonight Show throughout the remainder of his tenure, which ended with his retirement in 1992. What followed was one of the most prolonged acts of professional exclusion in television history. In what many consider an extraordinary demonstration of Carson's lingering influence, the prohibition against Joan Rivers appearing on The Tonight Show continued even after Jay Leno took over, reportedly out of respect for Carson's wishes. For 26 years, over a quarter century, Joan Rivers was exiled from the very show that had made her a star. The ban would only be lifted when Jimmy Fallon took over in 2014, finally welcoming Joan back to The Tonight Show stage just months before her death. "It was like being allowed to return home after being banished from the kingdom," Joan said of her emotional return. "I never thought I'd see that stage again." This wasn't just about a job offer or competition. The reason this feud cut so deep and lasted so long goes to the very heart of who these two comedy legends really were. For Johnny Carson, loyalty was everything. Raised in Nebraska during the Depression by an emotionally distant mother, Carson developed a lifelong pattern of keeping people at a distance while expecting absolute loyalty from the few he let in. His childhood had taught him that emotional attachments were dangerous, yet he craved connection. This contradiction defined his adult relationships, both personal and professional. The whispers around Hollywood suggested a more formidable side to Carson's need for control, stories of quietly sidelining anyone who crossed him, and discreet phone calls to network executives that could alter careers overnight. By 1986, he wasn't just a television host, he was television's unrivaled gatekeeper and decision-maker. 3 failed marriages had reinforced his difficulty with trust. By the time the Joan Rivers situation erupted, Carson had developed a worldview where betrayal wasn't just disappointing, it was confirmation of his deepest fears about human relationships. Joan Rivers, meanwhile, came from an entirely different world. Born Joan Alexandra Malinsky to Russian-Jewish immigrant parents, she grew up in a culture that valued survival and opportunity above all else. Her early career was marked by constant rejection and struggle. Even after achieving some success, she lived with the comedian's perpetual fear that it could all disappear tomorrow. "In comedy, especially for women, you're only as good as your last joke," Rivers often said. "Nobody was going to take care of me but me." To understand Joan's decision to take the Fox offer, you have to understand the context of her career. Despite her success as Carson's guest host, she had no guaranteed future at NBC. Carson, then in his early 60s, showed no signs of retiring anytime soon. NBC had given her no assurances about succession, and television was notoriously brutal to women as they aged. They weren't exactly eager to offer women in their 50s their own shows back then, noted comedy historian Cliff Nestoroff. Joan saw the Fox offer not just as as an opportunity, but possibly as her last chance. Media observers now view the feud through the additional lens of gender politics. Was Joan Rivers held to a different standard of loyalty than her male counterparts? When David Letterman left NBC for CBS in 1993 after being passed over for The Tonight Show, he faced considerably less industry backlash than Rivers endured. There was definitely a double standard, argued comedy historian Yael Cohen. Men were expected to be ambitious and strategic about their careers. Women were expected to be grateful and loyal. Joan broke that unwritten rule, and she paid for it for the rest of her life. What makes this story so tragically human is that both Carson and Rivers were acting according to their own deeply ingrained values and fears. Johnny expected loyalty above all else. Joan was trying to secure her future in an industry known for discarding women past their prime. Neither was entirely wrong, neither was entirely right, and neither could fully see the situation from the other's perspective. The Tonight Show ban outlived Carson by nearly a decade. It was finally lifted when Jimmy Fallon took over in February 2014. On March 27, 2014, at age 80, Joan Rivers returned to the Tonight Show stage for the first time since 1986. The appearance was brief, just a few jokes during Fallon's monologue, but symbolically significant. "It's about time," Joan quipped as she walked out to thunderous applause. "I've been waiting for this moment." 5 months later, Joan Rivers died following complications from a routine throat procedure at an outpatient clinic in New York. The outpouring of grief and tributes highlighted how completely she had rehabilitated her image and career in the decades following the Carson feud. Joan Rivers died in 2014 at age 81, following complications from what should have been a routine throat procedure. Among her personal effects, her daughter Melissa found something remarkable. Decades worth of letters Joan had written to Johnny Carson but never sent. Letters of apology, explanation, and gratitude that she had composed over the years but never mailed, knowing they would likely go unanswered. "My mother never stopped hoping they would reconcile," Melissa revealed after Joan's death. She kept a picture of the two of them in her office until the day she died. In her final autobiography, published shortly before her death, Joan wrote, "The saddest thing in the world is that Johnny Carson and I never made peace. I still feel empty about it." Howard Stern, in his eulogy at her funeral, perhaps best summarized the parallel lives led by these two comedy legends. Johnny had the throne, but Joan had to fight for every inch of respect until the day she died. In the end, she built something that was entirely her own, not a copy of anyone else's legacy. In death, as in the latter parts of their lives, Rivers and Carson remained separated by the gulf of misunderstanding and hurt that had opened between them in 1986. Two comedy giants who had once brought each other such joy ended their days unable to bridge the chasm created by ambition, miscommunication, and pride. And that wraps up today's look at one of television's most heartbreaking feuds. What began as the perfect partnership between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers ended in a silence that lasted for decades. Two brilliant comedians who brought laughter to millions couldn't find a way to mend their own broken relationship. In many ways, this story reflects the complicated reality of show business friendships, built on mutual benefit but vulnerable to the industry's relentless pressures. Carson and Rivers were both pioneers who forever changed television comedy, yet even they couldn't overcome the hurt and misunderstanding that tore them apart. Now we want to hear from you in the comments section below. Do you think Joan was right to take the Fox offer and secure her future? Or did she betray the man who launched her career? And Carson's unforgiving stance, a justified response to disloyalty, or an unnecessarily cruel punishment? Your insights add so much to our community discussions. If you enjoyed this deep dive into television history, please hit that like button if you haven't already, and subscribe to Legacy News for more stories about the legends of entertainment. We bring you the authentic, well-researched stories behind the headlines. No exaggeration, no made-up drama, just the fascinating truth about the stars you love. Let us know which other famous Hollywood relationships or feuds you'd like us to explore in future episodes, from Bette Davis and Joan Crawford to the infamous Sinatra-Lawford fallout. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time with another captivating story from the golden age of Hollywood.